I rise having just returned from visiting the Middle East, where I met with my counterparts from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE, Israel, and also from the Palestinian Authority. Of course, the ongoing Israel-Hamas war and the path towards peace was on the top of our agenda. These conversations were not always easy. We don't all share the same perspective, but we all share the goal of peace and stability in the region, and so we must be pragmatic and find a way forward together. While in Israel, we visited Yad Vashem, the memorial dedicated to the victims of the Holocaust, one of the world's darkest chapters. Mr. Speaker, it is important to remember that the persecution of the Jewish people did not start or end with the Holocaust. Before the creation of Israel, Jewish communities around the world struggled to find a place to call home, a place where they could feel safe, a place where they could live in security, a place where their human rights would be respected, and a place where they could live with dignity, have a family, and build a better future for their loved ones without fear. For the Jewish people, Israel is that home.
Last October 7th, Israelis saw their feeling of security and trust in their institutions crumble. And for many of them, it's broken. The terrorist attack from Hamas was killed the most since Israel was first created. 1,200 people were killed by Hamas and more than 240 were kidnapped. To date, roughly 134 of them are still in captivity in Gaza. 134 families are waiting desperately for the return of their loved ones so they can hold them in their arms. Mr. Speaker, it's impossible to find one person in Israel who doesn't know someone, either closely or indirectly, who was killed or not killed or kidnapped that day. So you can feel the power of this collective traumatism countrywide. So therefore, it is clearly that we once again condemn Hamas for its terrorist attacks on October 7th.
We also travel south to kibbutz Kfar Aza, one of the first communities to be attacked by Hamas on October 7th. There, I met Ayelet, the mother of Netta, a Canadian who was killed protecting his fiancé. Ayelet walked us through her neighborhood and recounted the agonizing massacres of October 7. She described the chaos of not understanding what was happening, of friends and family breathlessly running from house to house, passing those that had been set on fire, looking for their loved ones. But in many cases, it was too late. They had already been killed. And while we bore witness to the horrors of October 7, we could hear and feel the shudders of bombs falling onto Gaza nearby, followed by unmistakable peppering of gunfire. That moment, the duality of tragedy befalling the Israeli and Palestinian people was profound. And it was a moment that I will forever remember. Since October 7, more than 31,000 Palestinians have now been killed in Gaza. Over 70% of these people are women and children. 1.7 million Palestinians are displaced and even more at risk of starvation, disease, and death. I sat down with humanitarian workers who described the crisis in Gaza as the worst they have seen in their careers. They have witnessed mothers undergoing C-section without anesthesia, the desperation of children asking for food as cars are passing by, and the despair of children who are now orphans.
Mr. Speaker, it's now every family tree in Palestine that has been cut by violence that took place since October 7. What clearly comes out of our conversations with Ramallah is this. In the midst of this tragedy, Palestinians on the West Bank are also facing acts of violence that are growingly frequent and intense from extremist settlers. These violent acts alone cost the lives of more than 300 Palestinians and have forced the displacement of over 1,000 others since October 7th. We spoke with a family that was forced to leave their house by Israeli settlers and has been banned access to their family farm, which usually is necessary to their survival. Mr. Speaker, we are clearly opposed to this violence, and we will sanction those who are responsible for it.
Continue to struggle for their self-determination and the creation of a Palestinian state. A state where they could feel safe, a state where they could live in security, a state where their human rights would be respected, a state where they could live with dignity, have a family, and build a better future for their kids. Palestinians struggle for a home of their own. Mr. Speaker, this crisis has exposed cracks and deepened the wounds of society on both sides. It is fueled by dehumanization. And when we don't see the humanity of others, injustice falls onto the shoulders of innocents. This pain has extended throughout the region and here at home. In Canada, we mourn the loss of 8 Canadians killed on October 7th. Countless Canadian families mourn the loss of loved ones in both Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank. In Canada and around the world, we have witnessed a sharp rise of anti-Semitism and also a sharp rise of Islamophobia. Muslim and Jewish communities are targets of physical and verbal attacks. They have been harassed on streets and online, barred from places of worship, and made to feel unsafe in their schools. This is not the promise of our country, Mr. Speaker. Our government will continue to strongly denounce and condemn all forms of discrimination and racism, which have no place in Canada. Beyond the rise of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, this conflict has polarized our society and is testing the strength of our social cohesion. We're entangled in a web of devastation and face pressure to pick sides, forced to believe that if we speak up for one, of course, surely we're against the other. For us, it is not that simple. Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Speaker, given the state of the situation, and I doubt there will be no winner, there will only be victims and survivors that will forever mourn their losses. With the current levels of destruction that we have witnessed, it will take years to rebuild everything. Rebuilding Gaza will require our assistance, and Canada will be there. We will be there to rebuild healthcare systems in Gaza, particularly hospitals for children. It will take decades and even generations to uncover and deal with the consequences of the trauma lived by Israelis and Palestinians. And this is why, in this tragedy, I will always take the side of human dignity and the protection of civilians, both Israeli and Palestinian, because we owe it to Palestinians and Israelis who have been abandoned for decades because no lasting solution was found to this conflict. And aside from this failure, terrorists and extremist voices are being heard on our platforms, and they are undermining the future of Israelis and Palestinians. And this is not even to mention the greater impact on the Middle East.
Position is rooted in 3 principles. First, the right for Israel to exist, and by extension, to defend itself in accordance with humanitarian law. Second, the protection of civilians. And third, the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people. We fully recognize these principles are in tension with each other right now, but we remain committed to all of them. The violence must end. An immediate humanitarian ceasefire is urgently needed. And this ceasefire cannot be one-sided. Of course, Hamas needs to lay down its weapons, and all hostages must be released. The need for humanitarian assistance in Gaza has never been greater. Rapid, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian relief must be provided to civilians now. And this is why Canada will participate in every single way to help. Because of the urgency of the situation, we have resumed funding to UNRWA while supporting efforts to reform the organization. We will contribute to the Humanitarian Sea Corridor. We will support airdrops. We recognize that this will not replace the urgent need for more access by land, and will continue to press for it. We are gravely concerned by Israel's plan for a ground military offensive into Rafah. About 1.5 million Palestinians are taking refuge in the area, including many of our citizens and their families. Mr. Speaker, they have nowhere else to go. We've made it clear to the Israeli government that we urge them not to go down this path. En ce qui concerne la Cour.
In terms of the International Court of Justice, we fully recognize that the court's provisional measures are binding for both parties. The ICJ was clear. Israel must provide basic services, essential humanitarian assistance, and protect civilians. Mr. Speaker, in terms of export of controlled merchandise to Israel, I'd like to reiterate that Canada already has a very strict export permit system, and every request is examined case by case. Since October 7th, we did not approve any permits for non-lethal merchandise products, and given the rapid change in the system on the ground, we have not approved any permits since January 8th. The only way to reach peace and lasting security for Israeli and Palestinians is a negotiated political solution. In conclusion, we need lasting peace and safety for Israelis and Palestinians, and we need a negotiated solution. And I think that Canada has a role to play. Our diplomatic legacy is one of Lester B. Pearson, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Jean Chrétien, Brian Mulroney. It's peacekeeping and creating bridges to encourage negotiations. Today, we have the responsibility to build on this tradition.
Canada will remain committed to a two-state solution, including the creation of a Palestinian state where Palestinians and Israelis live side by side in peace, security, and dignity. The long-term security of Israel, the normalization of diplomatic relations in the Arab world, and the creation of a Palestinian state cannot be considered separately or in opposition to one another. They're intertwined, and we must recognize this and act on it. And we're committed to being pragmatic and doing our part. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Merci, Mr.
Questions and comments.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I would like to thank the Honourable Minister for her speech today. My question is this: we are in this situation where over 13,000 children have been killed, where over 30,000 civilians have lost their lives. I know that the minister speaks to her colleagues in other countries, allies in the United States and the United Kingdom. So I have two questions for the minister at this pivotal moment in time where all Canadians are very much hoping that her government will have the moral courage to do what Canadians across the country have been asking for. So my two questions are this: has the minister reached out to leaders within the United States to push them, to urge them to do more to make sure that peace can happen in the Middle East? And will she be supporting our motion today? Thank you.
The Honourable Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank my honourable colleague for her question and ongoing work. We don't always see eye to eye, but I know we can work together. When it comes to what is happening in the Middle East, of course, we're in close contact with different U.S. officials. I'm in contact with my colleague Tony Blinken, and I've been also in contact with many people within the White House. it is important that we get to a hostage deal. It is fundamental that hostages be released and humanitarian aid get to Gaza. We are extremely frustrated with the fact that Hamas recently decided before Ramadan not to take the deal that was on the table. And we urge all parties to get to a very important negotiation deal. Why? Because at the end of the day, we think that by releasing hostages, by getting humanitarian aid into Gaza, by getting to a humanitarian ceasefire, we will be able to get the temperature down, to stop the violence, and eventually to get back towards a much more sustainable peace for the region, which is fundamental for the region, but I must say, Mr. Speaker, also to bring down tensions here in the country.
Chair Kamal Taher, questions and comments, the honourable member for Wellington, Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Foreign Affairs speaks for Canada, and I did not hear the Minister clearly state the Government of Canada's position on this motion. I think the Government of Canada has often, in the last several months, been unclear on its position on the conflict that has emerged between Israel and Hamas, and so I'll give the Minister of Foreign Affairs an opportunity to clearly state whether the government will be supporting or opposing the motion.
The Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, as I said to my colleague from the NDP, I also say to my colleague from the Conservatives, of course, I appreciate working with him, although we don't always see eye to eye. I respect very much his input. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to our position has been clear. It is the position that many G7 foreign ministers have been expressing across the world, which is we need a hostage deal, we need to make sure that we get to a humanitarian ceasefire, humanitarian aid must go into Gaza. Of course, there are issues with the motion that is presented by the NDP, and we can't change foreign policy based on an opposition motion. Right. That being said, I also would like to know what is the position of the Conservatives. And that being said, I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, but my colleagues that are shouting, I would like to know whether they're in favor of a ceasefire or not when it comes to Gaza. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Question Kamal Taher, the Honourable Member for the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, Government House here.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I very much appreciate the Minister's comments on what is a very sensitive issue. Mr. Speaker, it is a heart-wrenching issue in which Canadians listen to virtually on a daily basis when they check in with the news in different types of forms. And I think when we reflect on Canadian values, the speech that I heard from the Minister is very much a reflection on what Canadian values are. But Canadians are having a difficult time and we have seen an uptake in issues of racial incidents on all sides. And I'm wondering if the Minister can just provide her thoughts in terms of how it is that we try to move forward and provide that sense of comfort that as a government we're taking a position in which Canadians can have that confidence in the government, in particular in working with our allied countries.
The Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would just like to note that I didn't get an answer from the Conservatives. Looking forward to having one on the question of whether they're in favor of a humanitarian ceasefire or not. That being said, when it comes, so I'm getting an information that they're not. That being said, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to Islamophobia, when it comes to anti-Semitism, when it comes to dehumanization, we have to do a better job in this country. That's the reality. At this point, a lot of people want us to condemn one side or not the other. We have to condemn both sides, and we have to help both sides to get eventually to an understanding that Israelis and Palestinians will have to live together in peace. And we, as a country, where do we stand? We're there to help. We're an honest broker, Mr. Speaker. That's what Canada does. That's what we've been doing since the Second World War, when Lester B. Pearson was there during the Suez Canal crisis to help with tensions in this very region. And you have my promise, Mr. Speaker, and this House has my promise that I'll make sure, as the Foreign Minister of this country, to keep the space for Canada to be playing a role in what could be consequential times in this region and for the world. Thank you so much.